Modders can create their own planets in Starfield. AMD say Bethesda can add DLSS support if they want, and there might just well be a no level cap in Starfield. All of this is the latest information for Starfield, and there's also much more as well. Here then is a load of new information from Pete Hines, head of publishing at Bethesda. Let's start with the topic I find really interesting, the whole idea that players, modders, will be able to add new planets into Starfield. Now, as many of you would be aware, games such as Elder Scrolls and Fallout series have always been very heavily supported in terms of modding by Bethesda. They released the Creation Toolkit, which to all intents and purposes is a modified version of the toolkit they used to create the games. I remember using the Creation Toolkit all the way back in the early 2000s with Morrowind, and pretty much every major release since then has always had the Creation Toolkit releasing shortly after launch. So Bethesda have said that the Creation Toolkit is not going to launch alongside Starfield, but it will be coming shortly after. This then will allow modders to add pretty much anything they want into the game, and yes, that does include entire new planets. The bottom line here is that yes, very likely that almost any biome you can imagine will be added into the game at some point in future, and this will also very likely mean that modders will bring in your favourite fictional planet into the game as well, whether that's Arrakis, LV-426, Pandora, or indeed any other world. And also from what I understand at least, it seems as though it will be possible to modify existing planets as well. Now, elsewhere in the Q&A and interview, Pete Hines said that Starfield doesn't really get going until after the main quest has been completed. He won't touch on exactly why this is or precisely what that means, but it's a very curious statement nonetheless. He also pointed out that Starfield will come with a New Game Plus mode, but that this mode is different to how New Game Plus normally works with other games, and that Starfield has its own unique take on that. But he didn't want to get into specifics because it said it would contain spoilers for the game. For those of you wondering what a New Game Plus mode actually is, essentially it's a way of starting at the game from the beginning once you've already completed it, but carrying on with some items or skill sets that you've already obtained from your previous playthroughs. Getting into the more specifics on gameplay, Pete Hines said that he's played quite a few hundred hours at this point in Starfield, but he still hasn't actually touched on everything. That said, he did give a few interesting anecdotes. One in particular was quite interesting to me. On one occasion, he managed to sneak into the back of an NPC's ship. He was unaware at the time that the owner of the ship, the NPC, was sitting in the pilot's ship, and as Pete Hines was in the back of the ship, the pilot took off and launched himself up into space. Interestingly, the player went along with him. Now, he did say that at some point he fell out of the ship, and it's not immediately clear to me why that happened, whether the cargo hatch opened and sucked him out into space, or whether he simply clipped out the ship somehow and fell down to the ground. Either way, this leads on to another question that was asked, whether or not EVA is possible. That's extravehicular activity, otherwise known as the ability to spacewalk. Pete Hines said he didn't know the answer to this. Now, that may seem a little bit stranger to you, that someone who spent so much time with the game didn't know the answer to such a, well, very specific question really, but it's quite possible that it had never occurred to him to actually try. It's also worth keeping in mind that as the head of publishing, he wasn't necessarily involved directly with the design of the gameplay itself. Another question he didn't know the answer to was whether or not players can fly directly from one planet to another. So that's once you're up in space, can you fly under your own power to another planet, or do you have to use the grav drive? Pete Hines didn't know the answer to this. Again, it's either because that's not possible and the only way to get from one planet to the other is to use the grav drive, or simply because he had never actually tried. Either way, it's a question I'm certainly interested in having the answer to, and it's an well, we should find out pretty soon, I guess. And actually, just for those of you wondering about this, I haven't been able to try this out for myself because, unlike a lot of other YouTubers out there, I don't have review access to Starfield. Now, of course, that's not going to stop me producing Starfield videos. When I do get access to the game, there are going to be a load of those videos, so do keep an eye out for them. That said, he did confirm that space itself is absolutely massive, and there's going to be a whole load of points of interest up there, all spread throughout the galaxy. Essentially, he explained that the experience we've had with exploration through Skyrim and Fallout 4 can also be found in space as well. And that means encounters with other ships, the ability to come across space stations, as well as derelict spaceships, and much more besides. And personally speaking, I suspect that the derelict spaceships are very likely going to act similar to what we've seen with dungeons in the Elder Scrolls series. And whilst on the subject of points of interest, there's going to be a whole load of settlements scattered around the planets as well. In other words, cities are not the only location in which you can find and encounter people. In other words, expect to find outposts as well as villages, that type of thing, scattered all throughout the place. Moving on to the subject of weapons and equipment for the moment, weapons in specific can have a whole different range of mods applied to them. When you combine different weapon mods as well as different skill sets, then you can end up with a very diverse set of options. If this works out as interesting as they say, it seems as though quite possibly you're about to really come up with your very own unique way of combat, or at least the combat that best suits your own style of play. Talking of which, they also touched on the fact that the boost pack is going to be very important, particularly the boost pack set of skills. Now, talking of skills, this is also quite interesting actually, because it turns out that you won't simply just be able to jump into any single ship and expect to fully pilot it. It seems that ships do have a tier rating, and the higher the tier of ship, the more difficult it is for you to pilot. As such, you'll need improved skill to be able to pilot the most advanced ships. Pete Hines seemed to imply and suggest that skills are improved through use, so the more you use a skill, the more it will improve. If so, this would be exactly the same as the Elder Scrolls series and the Fallout series. It would also mean that the more you fly spaceships, the more advanced you will get at doing so, and in turn, this will allow you to fly improved ships. So yeah, you're not going to be flying the best ships straight out of the gate. Whichever way it goes though, you may be wondering about, well, what type of activities you're going to apply your skills towards. One of these things is certainly going to be missions. Now, in other Bethesda games, generally you'd pick up missions from NPCs dotted throughout the universe. Sometimes this would be side quests, or sometimes this would be furthering the main quest. In Starfield, I think that's also still going to happen, but additionally there are going to be mission boards. Now, it's not clear yet just exactly how these mission boards are going to work, but my speculation here would be that these to some extent are going to be procedurally generated missions. Whether or not that's true, we'll have to wait and see, but one thing that was confirmed was two types of mission categories. One type of mission category can ask you to build outposts on planets, whilst another mission type asks you to transport people from one location to another, specifically from one planet to another. In a funny example of this, Pete Hines mentioned that at one point he'd accepted such a quest to transport people, but then went away and did some other activities, and 5 hours later remembered that the two people he was meant to transport were still aboard his ship. The final real interesting piece of information about the game is that as far as Pete Hines knows, there's not going to be any level cap. Again, he didn't seem to be 100% sure on this, and do remember, I don't think he was one of the designers on the game, but nonetheless, that, if so, if true, will be pretty interesting to see how that actually pans out. Now elsewhere, moving on to other subjects, we still haven't really heard much information about the PC version of Starfield. I know a lot of people out there are curious as to its performance. We do know that the Xbox version has been locked to 30 frames per second. We know that the PC doesn't have that lock, but we still don't really know what to expect in terms of performance in general. Word is, however, from what little information we have got, that people who have been playing on PC have said that performance is very smooth. Kind of related to this is a bit of information we got from Phil Spencer, head of Xbox, earlier in the week. We confirmed that Microsoft and Xbox have put massive resources into ensuring that Starfield can be the best it possibly can be. Now, quite naturally and entirely understandably, when Phil Spencer raised this point, it led to him being asked a question about Redfall. What went wrong with that? If Microsoft services are so good, why did Redfall have such a problem? Well, it turns out that the issue there was that Redfall didn't really get any assistance, or at least much assistance, from Microsoft or Xbox. Now, Phil Spencer said he's not going to make any excuses for this or try and fob anyone off, but just explained that simply it come down to the very poor timing of the Redfall development coinciding with the acquisition of Bethesda and ZeniMax by Microsoft, and that had some negative impacts on that title's development. For Starfield though, the story is very much different. Also, whilst talking about Phil Spencer, in another interview he pointed out that we could really expect Starfield to be more like Oblivion rather than Skyrim. It's a rather interesting comparison because these are two very similar games, but they did have some, well, shall we say, they did have some distinct differences. A lot of people generally do prefer Oblivion, and in part that's because Oblivion was a little less dumbed down than Skyrim. But that said, it wasn't exactly, it wasn't entirely clear what Phil Spencer meant when he made that reference. Again, something we're going to have to see. Either way, we won't have to wait too long to find out for ourselves. Now, in other information related to Starfield was an interview between Verge and AMD's Chief of Gaming, Frank Azor. So as we know, AMD and Bethesda have made a deal on Starfield, and AMD are Bethesda's or Starfield's exclusive PC partner. That also means that the game is optimized for AMD hardware. Now this shouldn't really be too much of a surprise because obviously Microsoft are behind Starfield now, and Microsoft also own the Xbox consoles, and those consoles do run on AMD hardware, meaning that it's understandable why they'd want the game to be optimized for that particular set of hardware. That said, it does leave Nvidia users feeling a little bit left out in the cold, especially when it comes to traditional Nvidia features such as DLSS. Now here's where it gets especially interesting. AMD have pretty much confirmed that the current lack of DLSS support in Starfield is not down to AMD. They've said that if Bethesda want to add DLSS support to Starfield, then they have AMD's full support to do so. In fact, he further clarified that on the occasions when they do make these unique partnership deals with studios, if those studios ever come to AMD and say, "Can we add DLSS support?" then AMD always say yes. So basically, he said that if and when Bethesda want to add DLSS support, then AMD will not stand in the way. He also very clearly made the point though that he can't speak on Bethesda's behalf, and just because AMD wouldn't stand in the way, it doesn't mean that Bethesda actually want to go ahead and add Nvidia support to the game. Ultimately then, this is still going to leave some Nvidia users feeling left out in the cold somewhat, but it also means that, well, a DLSS support and ray tracing, all that other lovely stuff, is not entirely out of the question for the future, and I wouldn't be surprised if at some point in the future that we see a patch that includes support for this. That then brings us to the end of this video, pretty much brings us up to date with everything that we know to date. Starfield itself is less than a week away. So let me know your thoughts and feelings about the game in the comments section below. Are you going to be playing on the 1st of September, the 6th of September, or are you preferring to wait and see what happens? As always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys and girls next time.